The guns of Europe fell silent on May 8, 1945. Across the continent, the echo of 6 years of war drifted into the cold air, the last rumble of artillery fading beyond. The Elbe, the smoke of burned-out cities curling into a gray horizon. Germany was finished. Hitler was dead. But the peace that followed was uneasy, hollow, and haunted. In Berlin, the capital of the fallen Reich, the ruins stretched as far as the eye could see. Streets were rivers of dust and shattered glass. Apartment blocks stood like skeletons, their interiors gutted by fire. Amid the rubble, the Red Army patrolled in silence, bayonets fixed, eyes wary. Soviet banners hung over the Reichstag crimson against the gray sky. The smell of gunpowder lingered still. For those who survived, it was supposed to be the dawn of peace. Instead, it felt like standing at the edge of something new and unknowable, a world divided not by battle lines, but by fear. In the spring of victory, Allied soldiers shook hands across the Elbe. The images were triumphant American, and Soviet troops embracing flags unfurled, smiles carved into mud-streaked faces. But behind those smiles lay mistrust. The Soviet soldiers who had fought their way from Stalingrad to Berlin carried the memory of 20 million dead. They had seen villages erased, families executed, entire cities burned to ash. For them, victory was not celebration, it was vengeance fulfilled. The Americans and British, by contrast, saw victory as liberation, the restoration of order, democracy, and trade. They dreamed of rebuilding a free Europe, open and peaceful. The problem was that both dreams could not exist on the same continent. The Yalta Conference, held in February 1945, had been meant to define peace. Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, 3 men who had fought a common enemy, now fought for the future of the world. Maps were drawn, nations divided, and words like liberation and security twisted into tools of empire. Poland, the country whose invasion had sparked the war in 1939, was the first to vanish. Again, not under Nazi boots this time, but under Soviet control. The Baltic states followed. Eastern Europe was quietly absorbed into Stalin's orbit, its governments replaced by communist regimes loyal to Moscow. To the west, this was a betrayal. To the east, it was insurance. Each side saw itself as defender and the other as conqueror. In 1946, as Europe tried to rebuild, Winston Churchill traveled to the United States and stood before an audience in Missouri. His words carried the weight of warning. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. The curtain was not made of steel or wire, not yet. But it was real enough. Behind it, Soviet tanks stood watch over Warsaw, Budapest, and Prague. Beyond it, Western Europe began to bind itself to America's economic and military power. The world that Hitler had shattered was not mending, it was splitting in two. At the heart of it all lay the consequences of his aggression. Hitler had sought Lebensraum, living space, for a master race, and in doing so, he destroyed the old European order completely. Monarchies, empires, and colonial powers collapsed in his wake. The British and French empires, exhausted by war, could no longer hold their distant dominions. In Asia, the Japanese occupation, born from alliance with Berlin, had ignited independence movements from Burma to Indonesia. Across Africa and the Middle East, the myth of European invincibility was gone. The age of empire had ended. But what came next was not peace, it was power. Vacuum. And into that vacuum stepped 2 new empires, the United States and the Soviet Union. The Americans emerged from the war untouched by destruction, their industries stronger than ever. They had built the atomic bomb, a weapon that had ended one war and terrified the next. The Soviets emerged scarred but hardened, their armies vast, their influence stretching from Berlin to the Pacific. Both had fought fascism. Now they would fight each other, not in open battle, but in shadows and propaganda, and in the constant threat of annihilation. The ashes of Hitler's war had fertilized the ground for the Cold War. In the ruins of Berlin, a child picked through debris searching for food. In London, families returned to bombed-out neighborhoods, planting gardens where craters had been. In Moscow, parades rolled through Red Square under banners that proclaimed eternal victory. But beneath all of it was exhaustion and fear. The peace treaties were signed, the soldiers went home, but the weapons stayed. New ones were built. Deadlier ones. The German scientists who had once designed V-2 rockets were taken in secret to America and the Soviet Union. Their technology, born from Hitler's vengeance weapons, would soon power intercontinental missiles and the race to the stars. Even in defeat, the Reich's machinery of war had left its imprint on the future. By 1947, the first cracks in the alliance had become chasms. The Truman Doctrine declared that America would resist the spread of communism anywhere it appeared. The Marshall Plan poured billions into rebuilding Western Europe, not just from ruin, but as a bulwark against Moscow's reach. In response, Stalin tightened his grip. Secret police puppet government censorship, a wall of control spreading across the east, and at its center the bomb both sides, racing to perfect it, both claiming it would preserve peace while preparing for destruction. The world had survived Hitler, but his war had remade it into something colder, more dangerous, more fragile. As the decade ended, Europe stood divided by ideology, scarred by history. The dream of peace after total war had become a new kind of conflict, silent, global, and endless. Hitler's aggression had died with him in a Berlin bunker. But the fear he unleashed, the fear of domination, annihilation, and control, lived on in every missile silo, every divided city, every uneasy handshake between East and West. The Second World War was over. The Cold War had begun. Summer 1945. Germany lay broken, not just defeated, but erased. Cities once humming with industry were now hollowed shells. Bridges sagged into rivers' rail lines, twisted like veins of scorched iron. From the air, the country resembled a corpse, veins of smoke rising from its heart, limbs shattered by 6 years of total war. Into this ruin marched 4 armies: the Americans, the British, the French, and the Soviets. They came not as liberators, but as occupiers. Their mission was to administer what was left of Hitler's Reich, to rebuild it, to re-educate it, and above all, to ensure it would never rise again. But beneath the shared victory, there was no shared vision. Every road in Germany now led not to Berlin, but to a border that did not yet exist. In July 1945, the victors gathered in the quiet suburb of Potsdam, just outside the ruined capital. Truman, Attlee, and Stalin sat around a long table in the Sicilienhof Palace, a building still smelling faintly of smoke and pine from the bombings that had scarred the nearby city. Maps were spread before them, heavy with red and blue pencil lines. The goal was simple on paper: divide Germany into 4 zones of occupation. But every line drawn across the map carved deeper wounds into the continent. The American zone took Bavaria and Hesse, the industrial south. The British zone controlled the north and the great port of Hamburg. The French zone, smaller but symbolic, stretched along the Rhine, and to the Soviets went the heart, Berlin itself, and the broad plains of eastern Germany, the land once called Prussia. Berlin, though fully within the Soviet sector, would be split again, 4 zones within one city. An uneasy balance, a shared prize, and the seed of the next great confrontation. At first, the soldiers on all sides treated each other with a strained politeness. American and Soviet officers posed for photographs, exchanged cigarettes, and shared toasts in the ruins of Berlin. But beneath the smiles, suspicion was growing. The Soviets stripped their zone bare, factories, dismantled machines, and rail cars shipped east as reparations. Entire industries vanished overnight. In the western zones, the policy was different. The Allies began to feed Germany, to rebuild, to stabilize, to prepare for a future in which it might stand again. They saw hunger not as justice, but as danger, a breeding ground for extremism. 2 philosophies of peace born from the same war. One demanded punishment. The other sought recovery, and between them lay a nation divided not just by barbed wire, but by belief. As the months passed, refugees flooded the roads. Millions of Germans expelled from the east trudged westward through mud and ruins, pulling carts piled with the remnants of their lives. Among them were children who had never known peace, only orders, bombs, and fear. In cities like Dresden and Cologne, survivors scavenged among the rubble, pulling bricks from collapsed buildings to rebuild homes one wall at a time. Allied soldiers watched from checkpoints as desperate civilians bartered cigarettes for bread, and women traded family heirlooms for a few hours of warmth. The war was over, but its shadow stretched longer every day. In 1946, the first real fracture appeared. Stalin wanted a unified, neutral Germany under Soviet influence. The Western Allies wanted a democratic, capitalist one integrated into a new European economy. The Americans had already begun to see Western Europe not as occupied territory, but as a frontier line that must hold against Soviet expansion. Truman's advisors spoke of containment, a new word for a new kind of war. In March, Churchill's Iron Curtain speech gave the division a name. The curtain wasn't just political, it was psychological. It divided the very idea of what victory meant. In Berlin, the tension was most visible. Soviet soldiers patrolled their sector with cold efficiency, while on the other side of the city, American trucks brought in food, coal, and supplies. Propaganda leaflets fluttered like ash from the sky, each side accusing the other of betraying the peace. For the people of Berlin, survival meant navigating two worlds. They crossed invisible borders to trade, to visit relatives, to find food. At night, the city was dark, power-rationed buildings still burned out. But the mood was changing. The sense of gratitude toward the Soviets who had ended Nazi rule was turning to resentment. Arrests, censorship, and disappearances became common in the eastern sector. In the West, meanwhile, the taste of freedom returned, cautious, fragile, but unmistakable. Newspapers reopened, elections were held, jazz played again in the basements of ruined cafes. It was not yet a Cold War, but it was no longer peace. By 1947, the economic collapse of Europe threatened to undo everything the Allies had fought for. Factories were silent currencies, worthless food scarce. To prevent chaos and to keep the communists from exploiting it, the United States announced the Marshall Plan. Billions of dollars in aid, fuel, and machinery flowed into Western Europe. Britain, France, Italy, the Low Countries all began to rebuild, modernize, and recover. But the offer extended to all of Europe, even to the East, and Stalin refused it. To accept Western money, he said, would mean surrendering to Western control. Instead, he ordered the creation of the Common Form, a network of communist parties bound to Moscow. Eastern Europe's economies were now directed by the Kremlin, while the West rebuilt under Washington's watchful eye. Germany had once started the war that tore Europe apart. Now its ashes were the ground upon which two new empires built their rival systems. And so Germany became the frontier, the testing ground of ideologies. In the East, the German Democratic Republic began to form under Soviet guidance. A state built on socialist reconstruction, secret police, and propaganda. In the West, the Federal Republic of Germany would rise, capitalist, democratic, aligned with NATO. Two nations, one people staring at each other, across barbed wire and watchtowers. The same land that had once dreamed of a 1,000-year Reich had become the fault line of a 1,000-year struggle. By the end of the decade, the last hope of a unified Germany was gone. The Allies' wartime friendship had dissolved into suspicion, then hostility. The world that Hitler had tried to dominate was now dominated by two powers that owed their rise to his destruction. Stalin's armies stood in the heart of Europe. America's bombers circled the skies. Each side claimed to defend freedom. Each side feared annihilation. The war was over, but the front line had only moved from the trenches of Normandy to the alleys of Berlin, from tank columns to intelligence networks, from blitzkrieg to brinkmanship. That a peace Hitler had forced upon the world was one of division, a peace made of walls. 48. Across the broken face of Europe, two flags now defined. The age, the stars and stripes, and the hammer and sickle. Each one claimed victory over fascism. Each one claimed the right to shape what came next. But this was no longer a war of armies. It was a war of systems fought through economics, science, and fear. The superpowers were being born not in the glow of peace, but in the shadow of what Hitler had destroyed. In Washington, President Harry S. Truman spoke before Congress in March 1947, announcing what would soon become known as the Truman Doctrine. His voice was firm, deliberate, the tone of a man drawing a line across the world. It must be the policy of the United States, he said, to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. The words were vague, but the meaning was unmistakable. The United States would no longer retreat across oceans. It would confront communism wherever it spread in Greece and Turkey and beyond. America, once reluctant to fight Europe's wars, was now committing itself to a permanent global role. A republic was becoming an empire, reluctantly, but inevitably. Across the continent, in the ruins of Moscow's outskirts, Joseph Stalin was shaping his own empire, one not of colonies but of ideology. The Common Form spread directives to communist parties across Europe: loyalty to Moscow, resistance to Western imperialism, total unity under the Red Banner. What Hitler had failed to achieve through tanks and fire, Stalin sought through occupation and politics, the control of the European continent. Factories in Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia were nationalized. Farmers were forced into collectives. Dissent was silenced by the NKVD and local secret police trained in Moscow's methods. Eastern Europe had traded one totalitarian system for another, the swastika replaced by the Red Star. And yet to millions still scarred by fascism, Stalin's empire offered something that the West could not. Certainty. In Berlin, that certainty was tested. The city, still divided into Allied sectors, had become the symbol of Europe's fragile peace. In June 1948, Stalin made his move. Rail lines and roads into West Berlin were cut. The Soviets sealed the city, hoping to starve the western sectors into submission. 2 million civilians, men, women, children, were trapped behind the blockade. For the West, this was the first real confrontation of the New Age. Retreat would mean conceding all of Eastern Europe. Resistance could mean war. The answer came not with tanks, but with engines. On June 26th, Operation Vittles began. From dawn to dusk, American and British aircraft roared into the skies over Germany, Dakota's Yorks and C-54 Skymasters. Every 30 seconds, one descended into Berlin's Tempelhof and Gatow airfields, unloading food, coal, and medicine. For 11 months, they flew day and night. Pilots learned to navigate by the glow of burning cities and the flicker of Soviet searchlights. Children waved from rooftops as parachutes of candy drifted down Rosenenbomber. They called them the Raisin Bombers. By the time the blockade ended in May 1949, the airlift had delivered over 2 million tons of supplies. The West had not abandoned Berlin. The Soviets had blinked, and the world had witnessed the first victory of the Cold War, a war fought without a single shot exchanged. But something deeper had changed. The crisis had transformed the occupation zones into sovereign states. In May 1949, the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, was formally created, its capital in Bonn. A few months later, Stalin answered with the German Democratic Republic East. Germany ruled from East Berlin. The heart of Europe was now split in two, a wound that would not heal for 40 years. Beyond Germany, alliances hardened. The Western nations, fearing another Soviet move, created the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, in April 1949. Its purpose was simple. An attack on one would be an attack on all. For the first time in history, the United States was bound to defend Europe permanently. The age of isolation was over. In response, Stalin created the Warsaw Pact, a military alliance of his eastern satellites. The two blocs now faced each other across a continent of ruins, each armed, each convinced it stood for civilization itself. The war Hitler began for domination had ended in a balance of terror, yet the real symbol of the new era wasn't in Europe. It was in the desert of New Mexico, where the first atomic bomb had turned night into day. By 1949, the Soviet Union tested its own atomic weapon, detonated at Semipalatinsk. The world had entered an age where war meant extinction. The arms race began that very hour. America built hydrogen bombs thousands of times more powerful than Hiroshima. The Soviets followed. Both sides claimed the weapons were for defense, but each one made peace more fragile. The world was safe, they said, because it was too dangerous to fight. The transformation was complete. The two superpowers now commanded global networks of allies, bases, and spies. Each exported its ideology like a weapon. Democracy and capitalism on one side, socialism and revolution on the other. Every conflict, no matter how distant, became a reflection of this larger struggle. Civil wars in China, Korea, and Greece were no longer local. They were battles in a new world order. The United States presented itself as guardian of freedom, the Soviet Union as champion of the oppressed. But both demanded loyalty. Both justified control in the name of survival. And in that justification, they mirrored the very tyranny they had once fought together to destroy. In a way, Hitler's war had made this inevitable. By tearing down the old world, the empires, the monarchies, the illusion of European supremacy, he had cleared the stage for two new giants to rise. The war that had begun in the name of empire ended with the birth of ideological empire, the rule not by borders, but by belief. The ruins of Berlin were no longer the symbol of defeat. They were the beginning of a new kind of empire, one built on fear, pride, and power, the true inheritance of the Second World War. The first light of the atomic age was not dawn, it was detonation. On August 6, 1945, a single bomb fell from an American B-29 over Hiroshima. 43 seconds later, the heart of the city vanished in a sphere of white fire. 3 days later, Nagasaki followed. The war ended, but something larger had begun, a new kind of fear that would define the rest of the century. In that flash, the nature of war itself had changed forever. For 6 years, humanity had seen destruction on an industrial scale, but this was annihilation by equation power beyond comprehension. When Hitler dreamed of weapons to end civilizations, they were fantasy. Now fantasy had become strategy, and from that moment on, peace itself became a calculation. In the first years after 1945, only the United States held the atomic secret. Factories in Oak Ridge and Hanford ran night and day refining uranium under guard. The bomb was America's ultimate assurance, its guarantee that no nation would challenge its power again. But in the vast steppes of Kazakhstan, the Soviet Union worked in silence. Engineers, physicists, and spies rebuilt what had been stolen from the ashes of the Third Reich, fragments of Nazi research, and the captured minds who had designed Hitler's V weapons. Among them were German scientists who had once built rockets for vengeance, now designing engines for apocalypse. On August 29, 1949, the Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb, RDS-1. The age of American monopoly was over. The world had entered a new balance, not of power, but of terror. In both Washington and Moscow, the logic was simple and terrible. If both sides possessed weapons too devastating to use, then neither could dare to start a war. It was called deterrence, the doctrine of mutually assured destruction. Peace by the certainty of extinction. But behind the clean geometry of strategy lay the chaos of fear. Children learned to hide beneath school desks. Air raid sirens became part of city soundscapes. Posters warned civilians to duck and cover against the impossible. In Moscow, deep shelters were dug beneath subways designed to survive the end of the world. The bomb had promised security. Instead, it brought sleeplessness to every nation that possessed it. The first real test of this new reality came on the Korean Peninsula in 1950, when communist North Korea invaded the South. The superpowers faced each other, not across Europe, but across ideology. American bombers filled the skies. Soviet pilots flew in secret beneath North Korean insignia. The war dragged on for 3 years, killing millions, and yet the bomb remained unused. Its very presence haunted every decision. Each commander, each politician knew that one wrong order could erase continents. It was the first limited war of the nuclear age. Limited not by will, but by fears. The arms race accelerated. Technology became theology. In 1952, the United States detonated the first hydrogen bomb, a device that made Hiroshima look small. The blast vaporized an island in the Pacific. The Soviets answered a year later with their own thermonuclear test, the RDS-6s, codenamed Joe 4. Each side celebrated these explosions as triumphs of science, as proof of national greatness. But beneath the rhetoric there was a darker truth. Each bomb brought the world closer to an accident that could end civilization in an afternoon. To command these weapons, the superpowers built arsenals that defied reason. Thousands of warheads mounted on missiles that could cross oceans in minutes. Submarines carrying death beneath the waves. Jet bombers circling the Arctic night. For the first time in history, humanity's extinction could be achieved by intention or by mistake. In the 1950s, the race extended beyond weapons to the heavens. The launch of Sputnik in 1957 sent a metallic echo through the world. The same rockets that could send a satellite into orbit could also deliver a nuclear warhead across continents. Space became the new frontier and a new battlefield. Each scientific triumph was also a warning flare. The Cold War was no longer confined to maps. It was above them in the silent void of orbit where ideology met trajectory. Back on Earth, fear became culture. Civil defense films played in classrooms. Drills became rituals. In America, fallout shelters were built in backyards. In the Soviet Union, propaganda declared the bomb a weapon of peace, meant only for deterrence. But everyone knew, from generals to children, that peace hung by the thinnest thread of calculation. Government spoke of balance. Citizens felt only the weight of anxiety. The irony was bitter. Hitler's pursuit of dominance had driven the Allied powers to develop the atomic bomb. His aggression had unified science, industry, and politics into a single engine of war, a momentum that could not be undone. When the war ended, that same machinery became the engine of the Cold War. The scientists who had fled Germany, men like Einstein, Fermi, and Szilard, had warned of the weapon's consequences. But now the weapon itself shaped policy, philosophy, and fate. Every decision in Moscow or Washington was made under the shadow of Hiroshima. Every crisis, Berlin, Korea, Suez, Cuba, was measured in megatons. By the late 1950s, the world had learned to live with the impossible. Nuclear weapons were no longer seen as instruments of war, but as symbols of status. Nations that possessed them were feared. Those that did not sought them. The Cold War was no longer just a rivalry between superpowers. It had become the architecture of global order, built on deterrence paranoia and the promise of retaliation. The war Hitler began to dominate. Europe had grown into a weapon that dominated the world. And yet amid the fear, something else emerged, a fragile understanding of consequence. The horror of the bomb forced humanity to confront its own limits. The same science that had reduced cities to ash also sent satellites into orbit, cured diseases, connected continents. The same engineers who built missiles built spacecraft. In the ruins of destruction, a strange balance formed, not peace, but the realization that survival depended on restraint. The world lived under a shadow that stretched back to 1945, and to a bunker in Berlin where a dictator's dream of conquest had burned away. Out of that fire came not victory, not peace, but the cold, enduring awareness that war had outgrown humanity itself. The smoke of World War II had barely cleared when new borders began to rise, not of geography, but of ideology. The old colonial empires were breaking apart, and in their place a world was dividing along invisible lines of loyalty and fear. In the West, democracy and capitalism were held up as freedom's light. In the East, communism and revolution claimed to be the path to justice. Between them stretched the wreckage of the old world, the ruins that Hitler's war had left behind. The global map, once painted in the colors of empire, was now being redrawn in the black and white of the Cold War. In Europe, that divide was literal, a scar of concrete and wire running through the heart of Germany. In 1949, the Federal Republic of Germany, backed by the West, rose in the western zones of occupation. To the east, the German Democratic Republic under Soviet control answered with its own red flag. Between them stood Berlin, a city divided, occupied and haunted by its past. In August 1961, under the cold light of searchlights, East German workers began laying the first concrete blocks of what would become the Berlin Wall. Barbed wire guard towers machine, guns all to keep their own citizens from escaping. Families were split overnight. Where once armies had fought, now ideology built. Barriers higher than any fortress, and behind those walls the memory of Hitler's war lingered like smoke, proof of what happened when nations surrendered their humanity to ideology. The division of Europe was more than political. It was a competition for the soul of the post-war world. In 1947, U.S. President Harry Truman announced the Truman Doctrine, a promise to support free peoples who are resisting subjugation. That same year, George Marshall offered billions in aid to rebuild Western Europe, a plan designed not only to revive economies but to prevent communist revolution. To Stalin, it was an act of aggression disguised as charity. In response, he tightened his grip over Eastern Europe, creating a buffer zone of satellite states: Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, all under the iron control of Moscow. They called it the Eastern Bloc. The world had split into two camps, two truths, two realities. The Iron Curtain had fallen, and no army had to fire a shot. Beyond Europe, the fault lines spread outward like fractures in ice. In Asia, the colonies once held by European powers were now battlegrounds of influence. In 1949, Mao Zedong's communists triumphed in China, declaring the People's Republic of China. In Korea, civil war became proxy war, where the United States and the Soviet Union clashed through surrogates each side, testing the boundaries of the other's resolve. In Vietnam, the seeds of another war were sown, first against French colonialism, then against the ideological ambitions of two superpowers. What had begun as Hitler's march across Europe now echoed in the jungles of Southeast Asia, in the deserts of Africa, and the mountains of Latin America, a world reshaped by a conflict that had ended but never truly stopped. In Africa and the Middle East, newly independent nations faced a different kind of invasion, not of armies, but of influence. The United States and the Soviet Union courted leaders, funded revolutions, and armed factions. Each airlift of aid or shipment of rifles came with a hidden demand: choose a side. In Egypt, President Gamal Abdel Nasser played both sides against each other, buying weapons from the Soviets while receiving aid from the Americans. When he nationalized the Suez Canal in 1956, Britain, France, and Israel launched a desperate invasion, a last gasp of empire. But it was Washington and Moscow, not London or Paris, that decided the outcome. The old world had ended. The new one spoke in nuclear terms. The Cold War had turned global, and every conflict, every coup, every crisis carried the echo of Hitler's aggression. In Latin America, ideology became insurgency. Revolutionary movements inspired by Marxism fought against regimes backed by the United States. When Fidel Castro took power in Cuba in 1959, he aligned with the Soviet Union. In response, Washington launched the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, a failure that pushed the world closer to catastrophe. The following year, the Cuban Missile Crisis brought humanity within a breath of nuclear war. For 13 days in October 1962, the same cities that had celebrated victory in 1945 now prepared for annihilation. In bunkers and command centers, men waited for orders that could end civilization. The ghosts of Berlin, Warsaw, and Hiroshima seemed to whisper through the static of radio transmissions. Not again. Even the race for technology was born from war's legacy. The scientists who once worked for Hitler's Third Reich were now divided, some building rockets for America's NASA, others designing missiles for the Soviet Union. Werner von Braun, once a member of the SS and architect of the V-2 rocket, became a pioneer of the American space program. The dream of spaceflight had survived the Reich, but it was paid for in the same currency: rivalry, secrecy, and fear. From the ruins of Nazi science came the rockets that would carry men to the moon and warheads to every corner of the earth. Everywhere the same paradox repeated. Destruction gave birth to progress, and progress carried the seed of destruction. Radar became television. Jet engines became commercial airliners. The code-breaking machines of Bletchley Park became the foundations of computers. The war that Hitler began had accelerated humanity's technology by decades, but it had also chained that technology to politics. Each invention was haunted by its origin. Every scientific triumph carried the memory of a battlefield. By the 1960s, the world was divided not just by borders, but by belief. American soldiers patrolled jungles in Vietnam, while Soviet advisors stood in the shadows of Egypt, Cuba, and North Korea. The Cold War was no longer a metaphor. It was a living system, self-perpetuating, fed by fear, pride, and memory. The world had survived the flames of 1939 to 45, but not their light. That light still burned in warheads and ideology in the eyes of those who remembered what had been lost. The map of the post-war world was a mosaic of alliances and enmities: NATO to the west, the Warsaw Pact to the east. Armies trained not for conquest but for deterrence. Generals planned not battles but scenarios of survival, and through it all, the memory of Hitler's aggression, the war that shattered the old order, remained the defining ghost of modern history. From the ruins of Berlin to the jungles of Vietnam, the shadow of that ambition still lingered, a reminder that no victory is ever final, and no peace ever secure. The gunfire of the Second World War had fallen silent, but the battle for hearts and minds was only beginning. The world no longer fought in trenches or on beaches, but in newspapers, classrooms, and the invisible frequencies of radio waves. This was the new front line, a war of ideas fought in words, symbols, and belief. It was a war without frontiers, where victory was measured not in territory but in conviction. From 1945 onward, the battle for ideology became the defining conflict of the age. In the ashes of Nazi propaganda, both East and West understood the same lesson: control the story and you control the world. Adolf Hitler and his minister of propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, had weaponized media to reshape reality, to turn lies into law, hate into identity. When the war ended, that machinery of persuasion did not disappear. It evolved. In Washington, agencies like the Office of Strategic Services, the Wartime Intelligence Service, transformed into the Central Intelligence Agency. In Moscow, Stalin expanded the KGB and the Department of Agitation and Propaganda, building networks to influence, deceive, and control. Each superpower had learned from the Reich. Truth was a weapon and perception was territory. The Cold War would be fought not only with bombs but with broadcasts. In the 1950s, airwaves became battlefields. The United States launched Radio Free Europe and Voice of America, beaming Western news into the Iron Curtain's shadow. The Soviet Union countered with Radio Moscow, a voice of socialist triumph, promising equality and peace to the workers of the world. Each message carried its own vision of salvation. Each claimed to offer freedom and accused the other of tyranny. In both systems, citizens grew up surrounded by invisible armies of words. The West sold prosperity, democracy, and the dream of self-determination. The East offered unity, justice, and the promise of liberation from capitalism's chains. Reality was divided, and each side believed its version was the truth. The arts became another front. In the West, jazz, cinema, and modern art were quietly supported by the CIA, used as symbols of creativity and freedom. In the East, socialist realism filled galleries and theaters. Heroic workers, loyal soldiers, radiant factories under red skies. Every painting, every song, every film became an instrument of persuasion. Even science was conscripted. When the Soviet Union launched Sputnik in 1957, it was not just a satellite, it was a declaration of ideological victory. The space race was a war of imagination, proving whose system could conquer the heavens. In response, America poured billions into education, science, and the Apollo program, determined to prove that democracy too could reach the stars. When Neil Armstrong stepped onto the lunar surface in 1969, his words echoed far beyond the Sea of Tranquility. One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. It was more than exploration, it was vindication. The Cold War had left Earth behind, but not its rivalries. Beneath the propaganda, fear remained the true constant. Governments on both sides used it as both shield and sword. In the United States, McCarthyism turned suspicion into policy, an internal witch hunt for communists that destroyed careers and silenced dissent. In the Soviet Union, Stalin's purges continued long after the war, justified by the specter of Western infiltration. Both societies lived under the same invisible regime, the rule of fear. The Cold War at its heart was psychological, a struggle to define safety, loyalty, and truth itself. Education became a tool of strategy. In American classrooms, children practiced duck and cover drills under the illusion that survival was possible in a nuclear war. In Soviet schools, children learned that capitalism bred greed and suffering and that peace would only come under socialism. History was rewritten daily, textbooks edited to favor ideology over fact. Every generation grew up in echo chambers of belief. Every mind was a potential soldier in the war of perception. But while propaganda divided, culture sometimes connected. Western rock music slipped through the Iron Curtain, smuggled on vinyl and reel-to-reel tapes. Bands like the Beatles became symbols of forbidden freedom, their melodies whispering rebellion into Soviet dormitories. Cinema crossed borders too. American films showing abundance and style. Soviet films showing unity and endurance. Each side watched the other through a screen of fascination and fear. Even in division, humanity found ways to reflect itself. Intelligence agencies turned ideology into theater. The CIA and KGB played games of deception that would have seemed impossible in Hitler's time: coups, disguised as revolutions, assassinations hidden beneath accidents, uprisings sparked with whispers. From Iran in 1953 to Chile in 1973, governments rose and fell under invisible hands. Where Hitler had tried to conquer by force, the superpowers learned to conquer by influence. A rumor, a broadcast, a bribe, these became the new weapons of empire. The Cold War had no front lines because everywhere was the front line. And yet through all the deception and division there lingered a single haunting similarity. Both superpowers, despite their hatred of fascism, mirrored its mechanisms. The surveillance state, the cult of patriotism, the suspicion of dissent, all had been tools of the Reich. Now they were tools of democracy and communism alike. Hitler's war had shown the world how fragile truth could be. The Cold War proved that even after fascism fell, the temptation to control reality never truly vanished. By the late 1970s, the ideological battlefield was everywhere, and nowhere in film, radio, literature, and even sport. When the United States and the Soviet Union boycotted each other's Olympic Games, it was not about athletes. It was about systems. Every medal, every anthem, every flag was a statement. Our way is better. It was propaganda in motion, carried out in stadiums instead of trenches. The irony was complete. Hitler's dream of a world shaped by ideology had failed in his lifetime, yet his legacy of total conviction lived on. The Cold War was the final echo of that belief that one vision could rule all others, that truth could be engineered. But as the decades passed, cracks began to show. Behind the walls of propaganda, ordinary people began to see through the illusion. Soviet citizens tuned in to Western broadcasts. Americans questioned wars fought in faraway jungles. Information, once the weapon of control, became the weapon of resistance. By the 1980s, the battle for hearts and minds was turning against those who had started it. The ideological war born from Hitler's aggression and refined by the superpowers had reshaped the human mind as completely as the physical world. It taught nations how to manipulate, inspire, and deceive, but it also taught people how to doubt, question, and see. The world was still divided, but the human conscience was beginning to unify quietly and visibly beneath the surface of propaganda. And like all wars, even this one would one day end, not with surrender, but with exhaustion. The 20th century began with empires and ended with ruins. By the 1980s, 4 decades after Hitler's defeat, the world that rose from his war was showing its cracks. The promises of the Cold War security ideology permanence were wearing thin. In Moscow and Washington alike, the language of power had grown tired. Behind the slogans, economies faltered, and belief itself began to decay, and in the streets of Europe, divided, patrolled, and silent for a generation, something was stirring. In the Soviet Union, stagnation had become a way of life. Factories produced goods nobody wanted, and the black market thrived in the shadows of ideology. Lines stretched outside grocery stores while portraits of Lenin watched from crumbling walls. The old faith that socialism would outlast capitalism was fading. When Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985, he inherited not an empire, but an illusion. He called for glasnost openness and perestroika restructuring. He hoped reform would save the system. Instead, it exposed its decay. The Soviet people began to speak freely for the first time in decades. They questioned the wars, the censorship, the sacrifices. They asked what it had all been for. And beneath those questions lay the long echo of 1945, the war that had built the world they were now trying to escape. In Eastern Europe, whispers became marches. In Poland, the solidarity movement led by shipyard worker Lech Wałęsa demanded free elections and workers' rights. In Hungary and Czechoslovakia, reformers spoke openly of democracy. Even in East Germany, once the iron heart of the Soviet bloc, crowds began to gather beneath church bells chanting for freedom. No bullets, no tanks, just voices. And each voice carried decades of silence. By 1989, the system that had survived nuclear standoffs, proxy wars, and propaganda was collapsing not through invasion but through exhaustion. The symbol of that collapse came on November 9, 1989, when a nervous East German border guard, misreading an order, opened the gates of the Berlin Wall. Crowds surged through. People climbed the concrete, swung hammers, and began to tear it apart. The wall that had divided a city, a nation, and a world. For 28 years, it had stood as the physical embodiment of the Cold War, of all the fear, ideology, and division that had followed Hitler's aggression. Now, under the lights of television cameras and the flash of fireworks, it fell to pieces. No artillery, no bombers, no occupation, just the weight of history collapsing under its own contradictions. The Cold War did not end in a blaze, but in a sigh. 2 years later, on December 26, 1991, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. Its red flag was lowered from the Kremlin, and the hammer and sickle disappeared into history. The superpower that had once risen to crush Nazi Germany, that had faced down the West for half a century, simply dissolved. For the first time since 1939, the world was no longer divided by war. But pieces always came with questions. When the dust settled, the consequences of Hitler's aggression stretched clear across the century. His invasion of Poland had ignited a global conflict that birthed nuclear weapons, destroyed empires, split Europe, and defined generations. Even his defeat had not ended the struggle, it had only transformed it. The Cold War was, in truth, the second act of the same tragedy. A world reordered by fear, by ideology, and by the relentless pursuit of power. The cities rebuilt from his ruins. Berlin, Moscow, Washington, Tokyo, all carried his legacy in their architecture, their politics, their very air. The world had survived Hitler, but it had not yet escaped him. As the 1990s began, the victors of the Cold War declared a new world order. Democracy had triumphed. Capitalism reigned supreme. But beneath the celebration lay unease. The same technologies that had emerged from the Second World War, nuclear energy, computers, rocketry, were now foundations. of a new global order, one still haunted by their origin. The tools of destruction had become tools of connection, and yet the same questions remained. How much power should one nation hold? How fragile is freedom when fear returns? These were not new questions. They were the same that Europe had ignored in the 1930s and paid for in blood. For those who lived through both wars, the hot and the cold, the parallels were unmistakable. The world had not escaped the cycle of rivalry. It had only changed its shape. Where once tanks rolled through Poland, now influence crept through markets, satellites, and politics. Conflict had evolved, but never disappeared, and the lesson that began in 1939 still whispered through the decades. Ideology can build empires, but only humanity can sustain them. In Berlin, the city that had seen Hitler's rise and Europe's division in the 1990s brought a quiet peace. Tourists walked where tanks once stood. Children played in the shadow of the Reichstag, rebuilt and ringed with the flags of a united Germany. The air was heavy, not with smoke, but with memory. For the first time in a century, the continent stood whole. But the past was never far away, etched in stone, carved into memorials, and buried beneath foundations. The ghosts of the old war lingered, not to haunt, but to remind. The Cold War's end did not erase the fear of destruction or the competition for power. It only transferred them to new arenas: technology, economics, cyberspace. The nuclear arsenals remained. The rivalries persisted under new flags. The world had entered a fragile peace, one held together not by trust, but by the memory of what happens when trust is lost, and that memory began with one man's war, with the decision in September 1939 to invade Poland. From that moment, a chain of consequences unrolled across half a century, from the battlefields of Europe to the missile silos of the Arctic, from the speeches of dictators to the silence of fallout shelters. Each event, each fear, each border could trace its lineage back to the same origin: Hitler's ambition to rule by force. History rarely ends cleanly. Wars do not vanish when treaties are signed. They leave behind systems, habits, and fears that live on long after the smoke clears. The Cold War was the aftershock of a world that had gone far too fast, the long shadow of a conflict that reshaped humanity's relationship with power. It was proof that even when the guns fall silent, the battle for the future continues, not on fields of war, but within the choices of nations and the conscience of mankind. Today, the relics of that long war remain. Rusting missile silos in the tundra, radiation buried under oceans, alliances born of fear still shaping global politics. The line between war and peace remains as thin as it was in 1945. But there is also something else, a lesson written in ruin and in resilience. That no ideology, no empire, no power built on domination can endure. That the only true victory of the 20th century was survival. From the ashes of Hitler's aggression rose a divided world, but from that division in time came understanding. A fragile, imperfect understanding that humanity's future depends not on conquest, but on memory.